Greetings Cenobite servitors and welcome to Codex Compliant.
Let's do something today that no other 40k YouTuber ever does. Let's talk about Space Marines.
It's always a little interesting to see which Space Marine chapters get codexes and what format they take. Sometimes the Blood Angels get a full one, sometimes it's a supplement to the main Space Marine one time they even shared with the Dark Angels, but even when they've been relegated to their codex is a White Dwarf article, the Blood Angels, like the Dark Angels and Space Wolves, do have a codex in some form, even if it's an edition or so out of date. Other chapters aren't so lucky.
The Black Templars are one of the chapters who occasionally have their own books, but historically not often. Despite being on the cover of 3rd edition's main box set, they wouldn't get their own rules until Codex Armageddon later in the edition, one of many army lists in that release. They wouldn't get their own dedicated book until 2005 during 4th edition, which is the book we'll be looking at today. It would also be the only time the Black Templars would have a codex of their own before they got their revamp in 9th edition.
Written by Graham McNeil, with additional material by Gav Thorpe and Pete Haynes, and with cover art by Paul Dainton, this standalone codex gave you everything you needed to play the crusading faction of posthumans, liked by many normal people, and liked perhaps a little too much by a particular kind of weird guy on Twitter. You know the ones. Also, we originally wanted to do this video back when there was fanfare for their 9th edition revamp, but I've got this thing with collecting old codexes where I try not to spend any more than £10 on any individual one unless it's something we really desperately need. Finding them cheap is just part of the collecting game for me. And this one always hovered around £15 and above, so I just wasn't able to pick it up. But in the end, I did manage to find it for £5, meaning that I won, and all it took to save a tenner was time, stubbornness, and a complete destruction of any ability for this video to be favoured by the algorithm, since the Black Templars are no longer trending. Please like and subscribe, save us from ourselves. But first, hear a word from today's sponsor. Do you ever look at your shelf of exactly 4 miniatures from 4 different systems and think it'd be really cool if there was just one game where I could use all of these together? Well, with today's sponsor TUSC, you can. TUSC, or the Universal Skirmish Combat Engine, is a tabletop skirmish wargame and the debut title of Sword and Board Games, founded by friend of the channel, Salamander. It's a game where, instead of building a list, you create a roster of characters like in a tabletop role-playing game, choosing their race, generating statistics, and then giving them skills and equipment, before you pit them against each other in small-scale battles of between 5 and 15 models aside. Though there is an included setting, the Tetrarchy universe, TUSC is ultimately a setting-agnostic game, allowing you to run sci-fi miniatures against fantasy miniatures, or as a way to play with your most deranged kitbashers, too sinful for most systems. It's also cheap, with everything you need to play included within a single $10 PDF available through DriveThruRPG. Link is in the description. Plus, you'd be directly supporting a small independent group of queer and BIPOC wargamers who want to create affordable and accessible games. So thank you to TUSC for sponsoring this episode, and now back to the video.
The fluff at the start of 2005's Codex Black Templars has a bit of Horus Heresy backstory that's mostly reprinted from the 4th edition Space Marine Codex, but it diverges here to focus more on what Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists was doing, and possibly to make sure you were actually paying attention. As told in this iteration, after the Heresy, Dawn resisted Guilliman's plan to split the old Space Marine legions into smaller chapters, saying the Imperial Fists would not be able to perform their duty protecting the Emperor if split up. However, before his constant refusals bloomed into another civil war, shots were fired, he eventually relented and the Imperial Fists Legion was split into 3 chapters: the Imperial Fists, the Crimson Fists, and the Black Templars. The latter were led by the champion Sigismund, and would take on his black and white personal heraldry as their own. The Black Templars are not arranged like a normal chapter, and are split into individual, differently sized, fleet-based fighting forces known as Crusades. And with their forces being split apart in this nature, the exact amount of Black Templars in existence is a little hazy. What is known is that there's definitely more than the 1,000 of them that there should be. possibly 6 times as many as that. Something members of the Inquisition have raised concerns about. Having too many Marines under one command rarely ends well. But the Templars seem loyal and nobody can actually prove anything since they're too scattered to count. So it's probably fine. Don't worry about it.
The Black Templars are fanatical warriors dedicated to the utter destruction of all of the Emperor's enemies. You know, more so than Space Marines usually are. And their distrust of mutants extends to the point that they possess no psykers. They favour brutal close combat to ranged warfare, and are incredibly independent, sometimes fighting alongside other Imperial forces, sure, but mostly keeping to themselves. Unlike other chapters, a new Templar in scout armour, known as a neophyte, will be trained, tested, and fight alongside a full Marine, known as an initiate. This sort of knight and squire arrangement means the chapter possesses no scout company. Or, I suppose they technically could have one, but just no one's in it. Each crusade is led by a marshal, and those are led by a high marshal. There's also the Emperor's Champion, a rank originally held by Sigismund back when he was an Imperial Fist. Basically, before a battle, if a Marine gets prophetic visions from the Emperor, he will don the special champion weapons and trousers and go into it as the Emperor's Champion, seeking out opposing champions and fighting them in single combat. It doesn't say what they do if 2 Marines get visions. Presumably they'd rock, paper, scissors for it or something. In essence, if you thought that all the Black Templars were a handful of unhinged crusading fanatics, then you were wrong. There's a lot more than a handful of them. Still, lore aside, let's take a look at the rules in here, because this was a codex that we did play a little bit against during 5th edition, but since the Black Templar player that we knew was astonishingly unlucky, like, seriously, you have no idea, he never made it to our side of the table, so we didn't ever really get to see what it could do, and we're still kind of curious.
Let's first go over the army list. For HQ choices, you had Marshals and Castellans, the equivalent of the regular Marines' Masters and Captains respectively, each costing an extra 5 points more than their vanilla counterparts. There were 2 types of Chaplain, again just like regular Marines of the time, and again slightly more expensive. We'll get into why later. These HQ choices could also be joined by a Command Squad, available in both regular Marine and Terminator flavours. Rounding out this librarianless HQ selection is the most interesting one. The previously mentioned Emperor's Champion. Any Black Templar army over 750 points had to take one, and although he was technically an HQ character, he didn't actually take an HQ slot. In-game, he could never join another squad, was armed with a +2 strength power weapon, and was required to go out of his way to fight enemy independent characters.
Although, the most interesting thing he did mechanically was the vows. The Emperor's Champion had to select one of 4 vows before the game that would affect the entire army, each costing a set amount of points. For example, you had Suffer Not the Unclean to Live, which made the Black Templars add +1 to their strength in close combat, but since hitting harder was slower, they all hit at -1 initiative, although neophytes didn't benefit from this. There was also Accept Any Challenge, No Matter the Odds, which meant that if it was possible for a unit to declare a charge, they had to, but counted as having preferred enemy when doing so. Again, this didn't affect neophytes. And if you wanted to know what these vows would have sounded like in-universe, well, those were included too. Lead us from death to victory, from falsehood to truth. Lead us from despair to hope, from faith to slaughter. Lead us to his strength and an eternity of war. Let his wrath fill our hearts. Death, war, and blood. In vengeance serve the Emperor, in the name of Dawn. Alright lads, lighten up. Still, it's neat that you were able to customise the feel of your entire army to whatever matched your style of play best, just with a simple upgrade.
Anyway, moving on to elites. They were basically the same as vanilla Marines, having their veterans, called Sword Brethren, both in and out of Terminator armour along with Dreadnoughts and Tech Marines. Of course, troops were a little different as, instead of tacticals and scouts being separate entries, they were combined together in the Black Templars' trademark Crusader squads, with the squad not allowed to have more neophytes than initiates due to their whole Master Padawan thing going on. These Crusader squads could be geared up for more ranged combat, or specialise more for melee, or mix and match. Whichever way, the neophytes didn't have access to bolters or sniper rifles like their vanilla scout cousins. Although the image of a sniper neophyte being dragged into close combat by his melee-loving mentor would have been a pretty funny one. Fast attack was assault squads, land speeders and a couple of flavours of bike squads, although unlike their previous Codex Armageddon army list, those bike squads could not include scout bikes alongside the regular bikes, which was a pity. Heavy support was Vindicators, Predators and Land Raiders. It should be noted that the old restriction of the non-Black Templar Marine chapters only being able to take one Land Raider Crusader was gone now, so it wasn't special that the Black Templars could take multiple. And this was all rounded out with their transport vehicles, which were the classic Rhinos and Razorbacks along with drop pods. So for the most part, the selection was very similar to the mainline Marines of the time, just lacking Librarians, Scout Bikes, Devastators and Whirlwinds. But what they lacked in options was made up for with the small print.
So, as well as the usual Marine and they shall know no fear guff, they had a host of other special rules. Righteous Zeal meant that if a Black Templar unit was shot at, they'd take a morale test, and if they passed it, they'd get an extra d6 movement, charging towards the nearest visible enemy. This rule is also why some units cost more, since those units came with the Crusader Seal's wargear by default, which allowed you to re-roll the d6 of this particular movement. They also suffered a -1 to their leadership rolls when subjected to 4th edition's target priority rules, that meant you needed to take a test to see if you could shoot at anything that wasn't the nearest target. This was because of them being so single-minded that they're not really able to focus on anything other than the closest enemy to them. They're also fearless, so target priority was one of the few morale tests they actually did need to take. Between all this stuff, it feels like a skilled opponent would have been able to kite them around a fair bit if the Templar player wasn't careful. But I suppose getting close enough to melee-centric Marines to actually pull that off effectively was a danger in and of itself, so it probably evened out. Oh, and due to their whole abhor the witch thing, the only psychers they could stomach being allied with were the Grey Knights, and even then, I imagine they're on thin ice. Their wargear was, again, very similar to their vanilla Marine counterparts, although they had a few extra bits and pieces. There's the aforementioned Crusader Seals, but there were also Cenobite Servitors, they're failed neophytes who can accompany chaplains and each add +1 to the distance of their Righteous Zeal rolls by carrying their sacred doodads. Put the Clive Barker things out of your mind. The Blessed Hull nullified lance weapons advantage on Land Raider Crusaders, and only Land Raider Crusaders, and the Holy Orbs of Antioch are there to remind you that the people who make Warhammer 40,000 are massive nerds and can't resist making a reference to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Basically, it was a holy hand grenade that always wounded on a 2+, regardless of your opponent's toughness, allowing you to blow thine enemies to tiny bits. There were 2 special characters, no more, no less. 2 is the number of special characters, and the number of special characters shall be 2. 3 is right out. Okay, sorry, I'll stop doing that.
Those special characters were High Marshal Helbrecht and Chaplain Grimaldus, and neither of them could be used in any army under 1500 points. Helbrecht was, unsurprisingly as he is a Black Templar, a melee guy, wielding the sword of the High Marshals, which meant he got an additional d3 extra attacks in the first round of combat, and he had 4 to begin with. Pop him in a command squad, in which he could take 5 additional neophytes, just to be fancy, and he's going to be a tough nut to crack. Oh, and one of those neophytes could be a standard bearer, which is interesting since scout standard bearers aren't generally something you see. Grimaldus, of Hell's Reach fame, comes with some servitors to carry his tchotchkes and is sometimes just too stubborn to die. So if he was killed, you rolled a leadership test, and if he passed it, he continued to fight with 1 wound remaining. Sadly, this only worked the first time he was killed in-game, because, I guess it would have been pretty funny and or frustrating if he just could do it endlessly. Unlike a lot of codices we look at, this one's colour section was the last chunk of the book rather than the middle, and it's mostly a showcase of the miniatures of the time. Although it does take the time to have a page on insignia, including the various banners and badges for a bunch of different crusades, and a page on painting Black Templars that uses paints that they don't make anymore. Although for those who are keeping score, by 2005 they had ditched Goblin Green rimmed bases as a standard, and the brown rimmed base had taken over as the default. This has been an instalment of Rimwatch. We really should find a different name for that, oh my god. Oh, and there is a showcase page of fancy conversions, and as neat as everything is, we are inevitably drawn to High Marshal Squidward here. I mean, no shade, we know better than most that sometimes you just cannot get a good photograph of a miniature.
So that was the first Codex Black Templars, and it did exactly what you'd expect it to. It elaborated upon what came before in their Codex Armageddon list, and really locked in the Black Templars' whole deal, although it did suffer from an issue many standalone chapter-specific codexes suffer from, that being that a large part of it is just reprinting rules that were already in the mainline Marine Codex. Unavoidable if you want it to be a standalone book rather than a supplement, so it's understandable why Games Workshop have gone back and forth on how they want to do these kind of books over the years. And it's not really surprising that this was the only Black Templar Codex for a while, since it's not like Marines but even more homicidal in melee was something uncatered for by other books. But still, it's been nice to have a look through the book, hasn't it?
It's been something to do. It's kept us off the street. Or has it?
What does that mean?
I don't know.
Hello, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this scream into the void that we call a YouTube video, please consider supporting the channel with a like or a comment about the weirdest Black Templar LARPer you've ever seen on Twitter. You could also sign up to our Patreon, where you can see these videos a day or so early, as well as get your name in the credits. All for as little as a $1 pledge at patreon.com/snipeandwib. Thanks again to TUSC for sponsoring this video, and we'll see you next time.